They fed on grit, firelight, and meals the world was never meant to remember. What did we lose when we stopped eating like the cowboys who refused to die hungry? They called it son of a gun stew. And if that name does not shake something loose in your bones, the contents surely will. This was not just dinner. It was survival in a bowl, scraped together from every last edible bit of a freshly slaughtered cow. We are talking heart, liver, kidneys, marrow bones, and whatever meat was left clinging to cartilage. Cowboys knew the value of a full beast, and they left nothing to rot under the sun. This stew was born out of necessity, but it became tradition. Boiled slow over open flame with onions, potatoes, and sometimes a kick of spice, it turned the unthinkable into something deeply familiar. You did not ask what part you were eating. You were just grateful it was warm, salty, and cooked through. In those silent prairie nights, nothing filled your chest quite like a spoonful of that stew after a day spent herding cattle through dust and distance. The old-timers said the flavor got better the longer it sat. Maybe they meant the stew. Maybe they meant the cowboy himself. Either way, it stuck to your ribs and reminded you that nothing gets wasted out on the range. Sourdough flapjacks were the cowboys' quiet morning anthem, crackling on cast iron as the sun pushed its way over the horizon. These were not your diner pancakes, light and fluffy with whipped cream on top. No, these were dense, chewy, tangy cakes made from a living starter that had been kept alive longer than some horses. Cowboys treated that sourdough starter like gold, feeding it with flour and water, guarding it from cold nights, and swearing it made their flapjacks better than any town cooks. Out in the wild, when provisions were low and the trail unforgiving, that bubbling mass of yeast and bacteria was a lifeline. Mix it with a little salt, a splash of water, and slap it onto a greased pan over an open fire, and you had breakfast, lunch, or even dinner. Sometimes they poured molasses on top. Sometimes they ate it plain, just grateful for the heat. These flapjacks were more than food. They were proof you could keep something alive in a world that tried to take everything from you. The flavor was sour, but the comfort was real. And in the end, it was not about taste. It was about ritual, warmth, and getting back on the saddle. Hardtack and coffee. Just the name makes your teeth ache and your eyes twitch. Imagine a cracker so tough it could break your molars and a brew so bitter it could wake the dead. That was the cowboy breakfast when options ran thin. Hardtack was flour, water, and salt, nothing more. Baked until it was rock solid, it could last months without molding. You could not bite into it, not unless you wanted a visit to a tooth puller. So cowboys dunked it in coffee. And not just any coffee, boiled, black, and gritty, often made with water scooped from a questionable stream. They drank it scalding hot, with grounds floating on the top like dust on an old saddle. Dunk the hardtack long enough and it softened just enough to chew, releasing a bland, starchy taste that somehow still counted as breakfast. This was not about pleasure, it was about keeping your body moving when the trail stretched out for another 100 miles. It was about chewing something, anything, so you could forget for a moment how far you were from home. It was dry, it was bitter, and it was exactly what survival looked like. One sip and one cracked bite at a time. Pinto beans and salt pork simmering in a Dutch oven over open flame. That was the heartbeat of a cowboy camp. It was slow food in a world that never stopped moving. The beans came dry, rattling in burlap sacks, while the salt pork came cured, greasy and tough. You had to soak the beans overnight, then cook them all morning, letting that fat melt into the broth until it turned everything rich and smoky. There was no rush, no other choice. On a cattle drive, you fed the crew first or nothing else worked. That pot sat heavy on the fire while the men leaned against saddles, boots off, sipping from tin cups and smelling the promise of dinner. Pinto beans filled your belly when nothing else could. The salt pork added just enough meat to remind you this was a real meal. Together, they built strength in tired hands and gave silence a flavor. It tasted like salt, smoke, and something nearly sacred. No one talked much while eating it. There was something about that pot of beans, simple, humble, and hot, that made the long road ahead feel just a little shorter. One bowl, and you could ride again. Corn Dodger cakes were not soft. They were not sweet. They were not even shaped the same way twice, but they were hot, fast, and they filled your belly when you needed something to keep moving. Ground cornmeal, water, a pinch of salt, sometimes a splash of bacon grease if you were lucky. Mix it all up in a tin cup, slap it onto a hot rock or skillet, and let the fire do the rest. These cakes were rough around the edges, literally. They cracked, they burned, they stuck to the pan. But that was the point. Cowboys made them by instinct, not recipe. They were trail food, meant to last a ride in your saddlebag or a week on foot. They were hard enough to survive the trip, but soft enough to chew after a few dunks in coffee or beans. Sometimes they called them dodgers because they dodged hunger, sometimes because they dodged flavor entirely. But nobody complained. These little cakes were survival disguised as breakfast. They reminded you that something simple, something made by hand and fire, could still get you through the day. And out there, that was worth more than gold. Wild game jerky was not a snack. It was insurance. When the land gave you a deer or an elk, you did not just eat your fill, you thought ahead. Meat spoiled fast out in that heat, so you sliced it thin, rubbed it with salt, maybe some cracked pepper or sage if you had it, and dried it slow over smoky coals. Or, if you were really out in the wild, you let the sun take care of it. Cowboys carried that jerky in their saddlebags like medicine. Chewing on a strip kept your jaw busy and your stomach quiet. It tasted like leather, earth, and the kind of pride that only comes from earning every bite. There was no expiration date, no refrigeration, just wisdom passed down through survival and smoke. It was not pretty, it was not juicy, but it lasted, and that meant something. When the trail ran dry or the cattle wandered too far, jerky was the difference between going to bed hungry or going to bed grateful. It was the flavor of perseverance, chewy, dry, and full of stories the prairie never forgot. Sourdough biscuits with drippings were the last comfort on a long, cold ride. Picture this: a battered tin plate, a single biscuit cooked in a cast iron pan, and a drizzle of leftover bacon fat for good measure. That was dinner. Sometimes it was breakfast. Sometimes it was all they had for the entire day. The biscuit came from the same sourdough starter they used for flapjacks, passed from rider to rider, bubbling like a secret. You dropped a lump of dough in a hot skillet, watched it brown and crackle, then spooned over the greasy drippings from whatever meat had been cooked last. If there was no meat, well, there was still drippings. Cowboys did not throw anything away. Those biscuits were dense, sour, and just greasy enough to remind you there had been bacon once, maybe even that morning. No forks, no plates, just burnt fingers, broken biscuits, and the sound of wind brushing past the fire. It was not fancy. It was not even filling most of the time, but it was hot, salty, and warm enough to make the prairie feel a little less cold. And sometimes that was more than enough. Dried apple slump was about as close as a cowboy got to dessert. And even then, it was only if someone remembered to pack dried fruit. The apples came leathery and tough, needing a long soak in water before they gave up their sweetness. Once soft, you tossed them into a Dutch oven with a handful of sugar, some water, and biscuit dough slapped on top. Cover it, bury it in coals, and let the whole thing steam and bake into a bubbling mess. The smell alone could hush a camp. Slump was not pretty. It was not cake. It was not pie. But it was warm and sweet and tasted like something that belonged back home, back where people had ovens and aprons and names for every dish. Out here, it was just a slump. Cowboys did not eat it often, but when they did, it felt like a small holiday, a reminder that sweetness still existed, even when the world around you was nothing but dust and sweat. It was a memory in a pot, stewed into something edible. And for one slow evening, you could almost believe the West was not so wild after all. Coffee-boiled beef was not some fancy invention. It was desperation in a pot. Take the scraps of beef no one else wanted, tough, stringy, gamey pieces from whatever animal you could find, and dump them into a pot of leftover cowboy coffee. The same bitter brew they used to dunk hardtack in now pulled double duty. The acid in the coffee broke down the meat a little. The bitterness covered the off flavors. And the heat did the rest. It was not a delicacy. It was not even good, if we are being honest. But it worked. It was hot. It was food. And that meant something. Cowboys ate it with sourdough biscuits, corn dodgers, or just by the tin cup. The caffeine probably kept them awake half the night, but better that than sleeping on an empty stomach. There was no seasoning unless someone got lucky with a wild onion or a pinch of salt. Just beef, just coffee, just enough to keep you going. Out there, flavor was a luxury, energy was survival, and this strange, bitter stew gave you just enough of both to make it to morning. Fried salt pork with molasses was one of those strange cowboy combinations that should not work, but somehow does. Salt pork was rough, fatty meat, cured until it was practically a brick. You sliced it thin, dropped it in a pan, and let it fry in its own grease. The result was crispy, chewy, and aggressively salty. That was the baseline. But every once in a while, someone would pull out a tin of molasses, thick, dark, sweet, and sticky. Pour it right over the fried pork, let it bubble and glaze, and suddenly that hard, greasy meat tasted like something worth sitting down for. The molasses cut through the salt. The pork gave it body. It was a weird sort of balance that made no sense on paper but felt right in your mouth. This was not a common meal. Molasses was hard to carry, easy to spill, and often saved for trading. But when a cook felt generous or a rider hit a lucky streak, this dish made the camp feel rich for a night. It was messy, it was sweet, it was strange, and it was unforgettable. One bite, and you remembered why cowboys never let anything go to waste. Campfire ash cakes were survival wrapped in leaves. Cornmeal, water, and sometimes a pinch of salt were mixed into a stiff dough, then formed into discs and buried in glowing coals beneath the campfire. Cowboys had learned this from indigenous tribes who long understood the quiet genius of hot ashes. It took patience. You couldn't rush ash cakes, pull them too early and they were paste inside, wait too long and they were charred to stone. But if you timed it just right and knocked the soot off gently with a gloved hand, you had something chewy, smoky, and warm. No pans, no utensils, just a bandana and a fire. Sometimes the cakes were wrapped in clean cloth or bark if you had it, but often it was just raw earth and prayer. Butter was a dream. Syrup was a memory. You ate them with calloused fingers, tore them with worn teeth, and washed it down with whatever passed for coffee. And when the sun dipped low and the coyotes sang, you ate one last ash cake and tucked in by the fire, stomach full enough to make it to the next dawn. Sourdough starter fry bread wasn't elegant, but it worked. When trail sourdough starters started to get old or too tangy for flapjacks, cowboys would turn to frying. The dough, stretched thin with bubbles from the fermentation, would hit a hot skillet or deep cast iron pan and sizzle instantly. Fry bread was thicker than a flapjack, denser than a biscuit, and it could be eaten on the run or with bacon grease slathered on top. What gave it staying power was its toughness. It wouldn't fall apart in your saddlebag, and it didn't go stale like other breads. Cowboys could carry a piece for days and gnaw on it like leather if they had to. Some claimed sourdough fry bread tasted better the older the starter got, but others swore it was just desperation seasoning the pan. No one wasted dough on the range, and if you had some honey or molasses stashed away, it became a treat worthy of a fire circle celebration. But most days, it was dry, chewy, and fried black in places. Still, it filled your belly and tasted like survival. Tangy, smoky, and just good enough to remind you were still kicking. Venison chili with wild onions was more a celebration than a meal. When a cowboy managed to bag a deer, it meant fresh meat for the crew, and nobody let that go to waste. The venison was cubed rough, no fancy trimming, just hacked and tossed into a pot. Wild onions, those pungent little things that grew near creeks and under shaded rocks, were foraged and thrown in whole, skins and all. Sometimes someone found a chili pepper or dried spice tucked in their saddlebag, and that was a day worth remembering. The pot would sit on coals for hours, thickening slowly, filling the air with the sharp, gamey scent of venison and smoke. The onions softened, the meat turned dark and rich, and by sundown, the cowboys circled in close. It wasn't chilly like townfolk knew it. No tomatoes, no beans, no cheese. But it was hot, hearty, and went down like fire in the cold. You'd lick the tin plate clean and scrape for seconds if they were going. Some men said it tasted better eaten straight from the pan with fingers and silence. Just the prairie, the heat, and the burn of something earned the hard way. Bacon and beans with slag sauce was cowboy cuisine at its most creative and most desperate. Start with what they always had: a pot of pintos simmered all day on the edge of the fire. Add whatever bacon scraps hadn't spoiled in the saddlebag: ends, rinds, and fat. That's where the real trick came in: slag sauce. This wasn't a recipe, it was a trail hack. You'd ladle off a bit of the bean water near the end, mix it with bacon grease, maybe stir in a little campfire ash or coffee if things were bland, and reduce it down into a thick, dark, almost sticky liquid. Poured back over the beans, it gave them a smoky, salty flavor that covered up any off-tastes. Slag sauce was different every time, sometimes sharp and bitter, other times greasy and rich. Cowboys didn't complain. They knew that a good pot of beans with bacon and some of that rough sauce could carry them through the hardest part of the drive. And when the pot scraped empty, the men would wipe it clean with a biscuit or flapjack, licking every last trace of that strange, muddy magic. Galetas were the trail biscuits that never died. Brought north by vaqueros, these hard little rounds of flour, water, and salt were the cowboys' answer to hardtack, but with a touch more character. Mixed, stiff, and baked hard, they were meant to last months. You didn't bite into a galeta, you tested your molars against it. Some cowboys soaked them in coffee. Others used them to scoop beans or stew. A few kept them in pockets and used them as emergency rations or even impromptu tools. They weren't soft. They weren't flavorful. But they traveled well, and they held up against desert heat, mountain frost, and saddlebag crush. Vaqueros would sometimes flavor them with lard or pork grease, but most of the time they were dry as dust. Still, there was something comforting in their weight, their reliability. You always knew what you were getting, and when food was low and the cattle were restless and nights stretched long, a single galeta dipped in leftover bacon grease could remind you that you weren't finished yet. You still had something to chew on. Coffee ground scramble was what happened when taste took a back seat to necessity. Picture a campfire morning, supplies running thin, and someone's got half a dozen cracked eggs and a spoonful of cold beans. No spices, no salt. But a bag of used coffee grounds sat drying near the fire. So into the skillet they went. The eggs, the beans, and a handful of gritty, bitter grounds, all stirred together with a stick or the back of a knife. It wasn't gourmet. It wasn't even pleasant. But it had caffeine, protein, and heat. And that was enough. Cowboys joked it would wake you up from the inside. The grounds gave the scramble a bite, like chewing on burnt earth. But you got used to it. Sometimes they'd add a touch of bacon fat if they had it, or scrape in slag sauce from the night before. There were no rules, just survival. When the mornings were cold and sleep was short, you ate what kept you standing. And if you could chase it with a tin cup of real coffee, all the better. But if not, the scramble had you covered, bitter, black, and buzzing. Charred cactus and eggs might sound fancy now, but back then it was a last resort. When the meat ran out and the beans were gone, cowboys turned to the land itself. Nopal cactus paddles grew wild, especially near dry riverbeds. You had to slice off the thorns first, carefully or not so carefully with a gloved hand, and then lay the flat green pads right on the coals. They'd sizzle, pop, and darken around the edges. The inside turned soft, almost mucilaginous, but still edible. If you were lucky enough to have eggs, you'd crack a couple into a pan and mix the cooked cactus right in. It had a sour, earthy flavor that stuck in your mouth, and the texture could be off-putting. But it filled a plate. The eggs gave it body, the cactus gave it weight. Add a sprinkle of salt or even a dab of grease, and you had yourself a meal. Cowboys didn't talk much when eating it. Maybe because they were chewing through spines, or maybe because it reminded them how close they were to going without. Still, it was green, it was hot, and it got the job done. Mule Skinner stew was named after the toughest men on the trail, the ones who hauled the gear and never got the glory. The stew reflected their job, rough, simple, and full of things others would throw away. You started with water and heat. Into the pot went bacon rinds, dried potato chunks, onion skins, and maybe a chunk of jerky if it hadn't turned moldy. Some old-timers claimed it always tasted better on the second day when the flavors matured, which usually meant it sat in a soot-covered pot under a saddle overnight. The trick wasn't in the ingredients, it was in making it taste like more than what it was: a little slag sauce, a burnt biscuit crumbled in for thickness. If someone had a dried pepper or even a splash of leftover coffee, it went in. The stew was dark, murky, and full of floating bits. But when your stomach growled louder than your horse, you didn't care. You blew on your spoon, took a bite, and let the warmth push the dust and ache out of your bones. Sowbelly and cracklin' cornbread wasn't about taste, it was about grit. The sowbelly cured pork belly was sliced thick and fried until the edges curled and crisped like bark. It was greasy, salty, and tough enough to chew on all day. The cracklin' cornbread was made from coarse ground cornmeal, water, and bits of pork fat left in the pan. You stirred it together right there in the skillet, scraped it into a hot pan, and let it bake or fry until the edges went crisp and brown. When the two came together, it was a match of survival. The fat from the belly soaking into the dry, crumbling bread, giving you calories that could carry you miles. There wasn't a meal much heavier or more stubborn. Cowboys knew better than to eat it on a full stomach. But on a cold night, when hunger felt like a hole in your chest, sowbelly and cornbread filled that space with fire. And when it was gone, you wiped the skillet with your last biscuit and leaned back in the dust, full for a little while longer. Cowpoke hush. Mush was what happened when all you had left was a tin of cornmeal, a dash of water, and maybe, if luck was smiling, a drop of grease or old coffee. It wasn't pretty. You'd boil the water, stir in the cornmeal fast so it wouldn't lump, and keep stirring until it thickened into a heavy paste. If you were smart, you'd stir with a stick and not your knife, because that mush stuck like glue. No salt, no sugar, just hot, bland survival. But if you could pour a bit of bacon fat on top, or swirl in some leftover slag sauce, it might pass for breakfast. Sometimes cowboys spread it out to cool in fried slices the next day, but most of the time it was eaten right from the pot, still steaming, still sticking to everything it touched. Nobody asked for seconds, but nobody went to sleep hungry either. That was the magic of hush mush. It didn't talk back, it didn't complain, it just filled the empty space and bought you one more day on the trail. Slung cow fat bread was never written down in cookbooks, but you'd find it in every frontier camp from New Mexico to the Dakotas. It started with a hot skillet and a fistful of flour. No leavening, no eggs, just water and muscle. Once you had a dough, you'd pinch off a chunk and drop it into bubbling beef fat, left over from rendering sweet or slicing up tallow. The fat did more than cook it. It preserved it, kept it soft for days, and added the kind of savory richness only a cowboy could love. When the temperature dropped at night and the wind ripped across the plains, this dense slab of fried dough felt like a hug from the inside out. Cold mornings meant a leftover piece stuffed in your saddlebag, eaten with coffee made from reused grounds. Slung cow fat bread wasn't about taste, it was about fuel and survival. It was for the men who herded cattle across brutal terrain and needed something that could last longer than their horseshoes. In the desert, in the rain, in the middle of nowhere, it never let them down. Dried pea. Porridge was a poor man's luxury. All it needed was time. Cowboys would soak the peas overnight in whatever water they could spare, sometimes laced with ashes from the fire to soften them quicker. Come morning, they'd boil the mess down to a pale, lumpy stew. If they had salt, it went in. If they had bacon fat, even better. But usually it was just peas and heat. One pot could feed 10 men if they weren't picky. The porridge clung to the sides of the tin bowl, stayed warm for hours, and filled every hollow in your belly. Some men called it gut glue, but they kept asking for seconds. When meat was gone and spirits were low, this was the food that kept boots on the trail. It didn't look like much, didn't taste like much, but when your ribs were showing and the sun had burned your shoulders raw, it was enough. Simple, heavy, and endlessly patient, just like the cowboys who ate it. Hot pebble soup wasn't really about the soup, it was about the stones. In lean times, when fuel was precious and wood was too wet to burn, cowboys would take a clean, dry river stone and heat it directly in the fire. Once it was glowing, they'd drop it into a pot of water, sometimes with scraps of jerky or sinew if they were lucky. The heat from the rock would simmer the contents just enough to extract flavor from even the toughest bits. It saved fuel, and it made everything taste vaguely of smoke and survival. The trick was finding the right kind of rock, something hard enough not to crack and clean enough not to turn your soup into mud. It became a game among the men. Who could find the magic pebble? Who could stretch a bit of soup the farthest? It wasn't hearty or rich, but it was warm. And when you were cold and half-starved, that counted for something. Campfire tripe wasn't for the squeamish. Tripe, the stomach lining of a cow, was slippery, rubbery, and stank to high heaven if you didn't boil it right. But when the cattle were slaughtered and nothing could be wasted, this was what ended up in the cowboy stew pot. First, they'd clean it in creek water, scrubbing it with whatever grit or cloth they had. Then it was boiled with onion skins, wild garlic, or just plain ashes to kill the stink. The result was chewy, sponge-like chunks that soaked up every flavor around them, especially grease. Cowboys who grew up poor in the South or Mexico knew how to make it decent. The others gagged and got used to it. It was full of protein and kept you full longer than beans. Nobody bragged about campfire tripe, but it was a reality of trail life, especially during drives when cattle couldn't be spared and all you had was what got left behind. Prairie oysters weren't oysters at all, but the young bull's pride and joy, sliced, cleaned, and fried in hot grease. Usually taken from steers after castration season, they were a trail delicacy if you could stomach the idea. The trick was slicing them thin, soaking them in salt water if you had it, then frying them crisp like bacon. They came out tender, nutty, and oddly satisfying. Some cowboys swore by them, claiming they gave you strength. Others choked them down out of politeness. They were eaten with chuckwagon eggs or slapped between dry biscuits and chased with black coffee. When food was tight, prairie oysters made sure nothing went to waste. Out on the range, the measure of a good cook was how well he could fry a fearsome bit of anatomy. If you could eat this and smile, you were a true hand, and if you liked them, well, you probably didn't admit it out loud. Pan-dropped dumplings were the cowboys' answer to fancy comfort food. No rolling pin, no butter, no nonsense. Just flour, grease, and a little creek water stirred into a rough dough. When the stew pot was bubbling, usually full of tough meat, beans, or root vegetables, you'd pinch off bits of dough and drop them straight into the hot broth. They'd puff slightly, absorb every bit of the stew's flavor, and turn into chewy bites of belly-filling starch. Some folks called them sinkers because they were dense, but nobody complained when they showed up at supper. On the trail, it wasn't about presentation, it was about not going to bed hungry, and these dumplings got the job done. They were especially popular in winter camps, where the extra bulk helped you fight the cold. Simple, unpretty, but reliable. They were a warm surprise in a hard world. Jackrabbit pot pie was always a prize, even if catching the jackrabbit took more effort than cooking it. The meat was lean, wiry, and gamey, often requiring hours of slow boiling to make it chewable. But once tender, it was packed into a stew with onions, wild herbs, and whatever root vegetables could be scraped together. The dough was usually a hard biscuit crust made from flour, lard, and water, thick and stiff enough to hold its shape over hot coals. It wasn't flaky like Mama's pies back home, but it sealed in the flavor and added enough heft to make the meal stick. This was not an everyday food. It took time, luck, and an extra rabbit. But when the trail was generous and spirits were high, it came out of the Dutch oven golden and steaming. A celebration in a tin plate, eaten under the stars. Grease-soaked Johnny cakes were flat discs of cornmeal batter fried directly in meat drippings. They were born from necessity and perfected through repetition. Cowboys made them on cast iron skillets over wood fires that licked the pan with uneven heat. The batter was simple, just cornmeal, water, and a pinch of salt if you had it. But the flavor came from the bacon fat or beef grease it fried in. That grease was gold. It kept the cakes soft on the inside and gave them a crunchy, caramelized edge. Eaten fresh, they were crisp and savory. Eaten cold, they were dense and oily, but still better than going hungry. They were stuffed into saddlebags, wrapped in cloth, and eaten days later with black coffee and a grunt. Grease-soaked Johnny cakes weren't elegant, but they were fast, filling, and full of trail-worn pride. Ash-roasted turnips were a gift from the earth, charred and softened by fire when meat ran out and beans got boring. If a cowboy stumbled on a patch of wild turnips or got lucky at a trading post, he'd toss them straight into the edge of a dying campfire. No pot, no pan, just glowing embers and time. The skins would blacken and crack, the inside steaming into sweet, smoky mush. Once pulled out and scraped clean, they could be eaten as is or mashed into whatever stew was boiling. Some folks salted them, others just ate with calloused hands and hot breath in the cold night air. Turnips weren't glamorous, but they were one of the few vegetables that didn't need a garden or good luck, just a little patience and a hot pile of coals. Spotted pup pudding was cowboy dessert at its weirdest. Rice was rare on the trail, but when it did show up, usually as hard, dusty grains at the bottom of a supply sack, it got cooked down with molasses and beans into a sticky, sweet mess. The spots were the beans, and the pup part. Nobody really knew. Some said it looked like a mangy dog. Others just liked the sound of it. It was made in one pot, stirred slow over the fire, and often served on special nights when morale needed lifting. The molasses gave it a brown, shiny glaze, and the beans added texture. Soft, but never quite blending in. It was a strange comfort, but comfort all the same. Cowboys would eat it with coffee, pipe smoke curling in the dusk, swapping lies about women and distant towns. Spotted pup wasn't fancy, but it was a reminder that sweetness still had a place on the range. If you've ever tasted something strange, greasy, or unforgettable by a campfire, drop your story in the comments and ride on over to subscribe so you don't miss the next bite.